Good afternoon. Good afternoon from the Oranje Vrijstaatkade, the wonderful space of Framer Framed, one of the participating partners in this afternoon program. Good afternoon, good evening for those of you who are watching from Indonesia, and perhaps even good morning for participants who are watching from the Western Hemisphere. Framer Framed is one of the three partners that are involved in setting up this wonderful program. Beyond Walls and Read My World are the other two, and we are extremely happy that we have wonderful guests, but of course, as our main guest, the author of a book that has been in the public eye in the Netherlands for the past couple of weeks. It's a wonderful book. We will talk about the book, talk about the process of writing. We will engage, hopefully, in a critical conversation, and hopefully it will perhaps not necessarily revolutionize your view on Dutch-Indonesian or Indonesian-Dutch history, but it will definitely enrich your knowledge and also your perception of that entangled history. My name is Wim Manuhutu. I'm your moderator for this program. And for those of you who've looked at information pertaining the program, I have to inform you that unfortunately Ms. Jessie Taihutu is not able to attend due to health issues, but fortunately Ms. Amanda Pinati is with us today. She's a curator at the Stedelijk Museum. I'll talk about her later in the program, but first and foremost, I would like to introduce our main guest. But, as the good Dutch proverb says, voor niets gaat de zon op. Only the sun rises for free. And so, therefore, both in the Facebook of Beyond Walls, Framer Framed, and Read My World, in the comments, as well as on the YouTube channel of Framer Framed, a comment is posted where you can pay as you like. And we are confident that you will like the program, and so hopefully you will also pay, right? Because another good Dutch proverb says, boter bij de vis. Nevertheless, it's pay as you like. But first, please join me in welcoming our main guest of this afternoon, the author of Revolusi, David Van Reybrouck. David, it's a pleasure to have you, and I can imagine that since the book came out a couple of weeks ago, you have been bombarded with people who want to talk to you, people who want to ask you questions. You've been in all major newspapers, and the average rating for the book is either 4 or 5 stars, bolletjes, or how you call it. There's been accolades and praise. And before you came out with the book, and perhaps that's the first question I would like to ask you. In the last couple of years, we have seen that discussions on the colonial past of the Netherlands and Indonesia have been on the rise. And more often than not, people would say, well, you know, we're not going to come to a final conclusion, but David will help us as his book comes out. While working on this book, and what we will do this afternoon is to especially look at a more critical engagement with that colonial past, engaging diasporas, but also more post or decolonial perspectives on that history. Didn't that put an enormous pressure on your shoulders, knowing that everyone in the Netherlands was thinking, we cannot solve it, so let David do it?
Yes. It's a very long question with a very short answer, but yes, of course, I felt that pressure, and I felt that pressure mounting as I went along writing the book. And but it is what it is. It is not because a topical has become controversial or emotional that one should avoid it. It's quite the opposite. Precisely because it is so highly controversial, I think the debate on it is possible. And the phrase you just used before, David is going to help us, that's perhaps the most beautiful compliment I've heard so far, because that's perhaps what I hope to achieve with the book. Let it be part of a much broader effort to come to terms with the painful past.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and that's very modest and very, very, very gracious of you to say so. However, what does it say about the Netherlands? That I say I'm living in the Netherlands as a member of post-colonial diaspora, that we need somewhat of an insider-outsider to shed light or to help the discussion along. What does it tell about the discussion?
I don't know, to be quite honest. I asked myself the question quite often before I started writing, like, am I the person to write this book? Given my nationality, my age, my gender, the color of skin I happen to have, these are things I cannot do a lot about it. But they definitely did make me wonder whether I was the person best suited to embark on such a project. Your question, what does it say about the state of the Netherlands that it has not been written by a Dutch person, could be countered by another observation, that is that people apparently have been waiting for this book, whoever was going to write it. My impression was, over the past couple of years, that there is a generation, and it's not just a generational thing, that we've come to a moment in Dutch public history that there is a readiness to, it's been boiling for a couple of years already. Ever since Jeffrey Pondaag started organizing lawsuits against the Dutch national state on behalf of a number of victims, especially widows or children of fathers who were killed, or husbands who were killed during the decolonization war, it's been on the agenda. There's a couple of books behind me here. I mean, there's Alfred Birni, The Talk van Java, there's Stef Scaliola. All these books have come out over the past 20 years. And even before that, I mean, if you go back in time, let's say like since the late 1960s, this has been warming up. And I think I'm part of that movement. People are getting ready to come to terms with something that many people did not want to see, did not want to hear, could not possibly believe that it was true. And my impression is, and it's not just the younger generation, I think for the younger generation it's somehow easier. They've grown up in a multicultural Holland, that changes your vision from day one. But I've also spoken to elderly veterans, Dutch veterans, whom I visited over the course of a couple of years. I remember one man in Zierikzee who said, the first time I visited him, like, oh, Hutting die rode rakker, Hutting Job Hutting, who was the whistleblower, that red guy, I mean, that was nonsense. And then I came back to his same place, and he had just written the book by Remy Limpach, the massive volume on the brandende kampongs van Generaal Spoor. And he told me, it seems as if I have served in a different army. I didn't know it was that bad. So even for a person who was a staunch defender of the Dutch late colonial, or at least the veteran perspective, even these people are changing their views because of what is coming to light now. And I hope the book is part of that movement.
Yeah. I think many readers will be thankful that at the end of your book you include a bibliographic essay to bring out the sources that you have used for in the writing process. Obviously the bibliography is much longer, and I think many students will be thankful because you basically help them to prepare if they have to do a paper or a thesis. But it also shows that that you're right when you talk about a longer movement and a development, because Ontsporing van Geweld by Van Doorn and Hendricks is there from 1970, never picked up. even when it was reissued a couple of years ago, obviously. What I would like to know, because in your book, you take your time actually to build and to contextualize the story. You start with the very early archaeological evidence, first migration, and then to early colonial history. And thank you for mentioning that Ambon was actually the first Dutch possession in the archipelago. But I was wondering, in the 19th century, when we talk about the Java War, the Great War on Java, led by Prince Diponegoro, it of course coincided with the breakaway of Belgium.
Yeah.
And you have a very intriguing remark on that.
There is a connection between the two. Well, the Kingdom of the Netherlands has lost territory twice over the past 200 years. First time was in 1830 with the Belgian independence. Second time was in 1945 with the Indonesian independence. So somehow I know what it means to break away from the Netherlands, from my personal history. But on a more serious note, it's true that both are related. Losing Belgium was for King Willem I a massive loss in terms of financial income for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, for the simple reason that he needed the economy of the Borinage, which is the French-speaking part of Belgium, which is rich in mines, and then the Ghent-based textile industry. These were the two major industries. Belgium was more industrialized than the Netherlands at the time of Willem I. So losing the income and the revenues of those industrial economies, mining and textile weaving, meant a serious blowback. And one of the reasons, so he lost that money, and then for 9 years he continued waging a war against the Belgian independence, not unlike the 5 years that the Netherlands waged the war against the Indonesian independence struggle between 45 and 49. There was a reluctance to let go, and a stubbornness, especially in the case of William I. And so, realizing that he lost Belgium, left a void in the national treasury. And at that point, he decided the whole cultural system, the cultivation system, as it is called in English, het cultuurstelsel, was invented to make sure that national treasury was going to be enriched with revenues coming from elsewhere. If it was not going to come from Belgium, at least it could come from Java. And that's why his whole colonial administration there was so instrumental in making that new economic and fiscal policy. So there is a strong connection between what happened in Belgium and the results in what happened in Java.
Well, what is interesting, and thank you for this clarifying answer, is of course the interconnectivity. Because with the money coming out from the Netherlands Indies in 1963, former slave owners who used to own enslaved people in Suriname could be compensated. So there's this irony that poor peasants in Indonesia paid for the emancipation of enslaved people in Suriname. And if I look at the book, and you started our conversation also being very self-reflexive. The fact, and you made a joke about it, but in the book you sometimes mention that some people thought this is a representative, this is a person from the Netherlands. So
this is the way people look upon
perceived,
me.
Yeah. And so how did you?
That's a complete failure because I'm not. I mean, I'm not Dutch. I'm Belgian. But it is true that the Netherlands is certainly the foreign country I know best, and not only because of the language connection. It's a country where I've been traveling to very frequently from my age 20 onwards. I've spent many years here. I wrote my PhD here. My partner is Dutch. And there is much I admire in Dutch society, let this be said. And I grew up as a child on the Flemish countryside with the idea that we were country bumpkins and that the Netherlands were, as my father used to say, Hollanders, groot volk. This is the image with which I grew up. I remember one time driving with my father to Leiden, where I was living then, and we were crossing at Holland's Diep, the massive bridge crossing the river. This is and there's much I admire in the Netherlands. And perhaps because of that perspective, I do feel free to also express my sense of surprise, wonder, and even astonishment to see or to analyze the way the Dutch have been dealing with their colonial past, which is not the thing which I'm most impressed by.
Couldn't that be, though, that because, as you say, the Nederlanders, groot volk, they're doing great, there is also this self-image. We are basically smarter, better than other colonial powers, perhaps, that this also was a hindrance of really opening up and listening to the feelings and the ambitions and the complaints of colonial subjects.
I think this is a topic about the ambivalence of pride. I come from a country which is not very proud, and sometimes I even do resent that. Pride can be a factor for good as well, but it always entails the danger of creating blind spots. And a year ago, a PhD was published, I mentioned in the introduction of the book, a PhD was published on school textbooks for secondary education for history courses. And it was a comparison between British and Dutch textbooks. And it turned out that even the most recent Dutch handbooks, or even re-editions of older books, still use as the major frame for looking at the past 300 years of national history as Holland a tradition of democracy and tolerance. There's much to be said for that, because there are strong elements there. But if your main frame is set through that angle, it becomes very hard to have a look at the darker pages of your national past. I mean, imagine, I come from a very different country. I was never, in my textbook, there was never, when Belgium has been historically quite important in the rise of constitutionalism. The Belgian constitution of 1831 was quite a source of inspiration. It's been the most copied constitution. This is something I never heard in my secondary school education. We heard about the difficulties of Belgium. And so there was not this idea of being a nation that could be proud of itself because of its democratic or tolerance tradition.
When it comes to, and you refer to that already, this feeling of tolerance and freedom, in the back of you is of course Professor Gloria Wecker's important book, White Innocence, where she also investigates this self-image of, and especially when it comes to the colonial history. David, when I read the book, and you know, it's a page turner, I have to say. You know,
is it? Yeah.
It is.
Thanks.
But one of the things that I stumbled upon a couple of times, and you say it in the beginning, and of course, as a writer, language is important, right?
Yeah.
And there are some instances in the book where, and perhaps you could clarify. For instance, we have these different terms to refer to the Indonesian population, be it native or indigenous, inlands and inheems.
Yeah.
And it comes up in the book, and in the beginning, somewhere in the beginning, you say, well, I actually prefer indigenous, inheems, because I know that inlands has this colonial connotation. But it does pop up every once and again in the book. And so you just told me before we started that the people who were doing the editing and were working 24/7. So this ambiguity, if I may say.
It is, and I found it very, very hard to find the right adjective. To my Dutch feeling, which is Belgian Dutch, Flemish, the word inlands sounded more neutral. But many of my friends and Indonesian friends in the Netherlands told me, please don't use the word inlands. Apart from elderly Indonesian people living in the Netherlands, they're like, I'm inlands, I don't have any difficulty with that. The problem was, how can you describe this variety of people living in that archipelago with one easy and comprehensible adjective? using the word Indonesian, which I did, and which I do increasingly, to be quite honest, is a bit of an anachronism. It feels like talking about the Belgians in the 16th century. There was nothing like Belgian back then. So it feels a bit strange to talk about Indonesians in the 17th century. It's an anachronism, although I use it increasingly. I've been observing myself. The word, then you have the word the original population, or the local population. Local sounded like a bad adjective given the size of the country. You put it on the map of Europe, it starts in Ireland and it ends in Kazakhstan. Calling that local seems like a very colonial trope. Talking about the original population or aboriginal population is problematic. I give in the beginning of the book the whole history, the migration histories. What is original in an archipelago where so many layers of migration have crossed each other? So Indonesian was problematic, local was problematic, original was problematic, inlands was problematic. And I said, well, the English, they have the word indigenous. Is that a word that we could translate? And in Dutch we have the word inheems, which many people told me it's better than inlands. I'm not quite happy with it either. And so I started to use increasingly the term Indonesian, although I'm quite unsatisfied. So I didn't find a final solution for that conundrum.
So we were struggling with that. And definitely, you know, we are talking about language and the change in language all the time when we talk about perspectives on colonial history. For instance, the main body of the book is, of course, about the Indonesian-Dutch conflict, the Revolusi, and then, of course, you very aptly say that it was a 5-year war. It was not just those two military actions that, until rather recently, were very euphemistically, but very consciously by the Dutch, called police actions. The term does return. Was it a choice to make it more accessible to readers?
Yeah, it was something I've been thinking about it as well. How should I call the so-called politionele acties, which were not police events and not actions either. I kept the terminology though, although it's objectively, semantically, it's a very problematic notion. I found the idea that the word politioneel, police related, that has been debunked sufficiently now. I mean, many people know it was a war, but I've been problematizing the word action. It suggests a short-term phase of police moving. And you see it in many maps, for instance, as well. There were two police actions, and both lasted 2 weeks. And on most maps you see in books, you see the maps of Java and Sumatra, and most of the land is in the hands of the Republicans. And all of a sudden, after 2 police actions, the Dutch territory has been massively enlarged. That's highly problematic. What happened during these 2 weeks is that the borders were pushed, but it didn't mean that the newly conquered territories were completely pacified and controlled. Far from it. I think it's very important to be aware of the fact that these 2 police actions gave rise to guerrilla warfare that lasted for many, many months. And the Dutch did not conquer new territory. They moved the boundary and they controlled the boundary and had to fight within the realm they just said to control, but they did not control. And so problematizing the word action, I do it in the very beginning of the chapter, like, folks, this is not easy gain, this is not easy territorial win. It's moving the boundaries. What the Dutch had after these 2 weeks, the double event of 2 weeks, was like they controlled the major roads and the major urban centers, and the countryside and the forest was completely in the hands of the so-called guerrillas, which were just the Indonesian army going on.
In the beginning of the book and throughout the book and using also notes, and thank you for that, even though Barack Obama once said, or recently said, I hate footnotes, I hate endnotes, but notes are of course very important. You acknowledge all the academic work that has been done. But you've also stated that, you know, despite all the research, sometimes these general images about this period are very resilient, very resilient against new academic research. Do you think that by writing a book that is more accessible, that draws from academic research but is not academic, quote unquote, per se. You hope that you will be able to shift that perspective or to contribute to a shift? Or
That's what I hope. Whether it'll succeed remains to be seen. But I was struck by an enormous gap between high quality academic research being done also in the Netherlands. I'm really impressed by a number of scholars from today and from the past. But I'm also struck by the difficulty there is to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and public knowledge. And this has to do with reforming the Dutch schooling system in the 1990s, where the compulsory number of hours of history class has been brought down to 3 hours a week. In Flanders, every student has got to sit through 6 hours of history, 6 years, excuse me, six years of history, and in the Netherlands it's 3 years, excuse me. And that's extraordinary. And although efforts have been done in the Netherlands, Piet van Rooij's curriculum and trying to, although it's quite Eurocentric, at least it gave a framework for teachers. And the canon, the Dutch canon, tries to give 50 windows. But all this does not change the fact that school kids do not get a lot of history at school. And so it becomes very hard to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and raising public awareness. And I hope the bridge, very often I experience my role as a writer. I used to be an academic. I left academia and I still love academia, although I'm happy not to work there anymore. I love the outcome, and but I'm happy I can work as a creative author. But I do seem to miss sometimes the bridge between these two worlds.
One of the extraordinary things about the book is, of course, the fact that you spoke to so many people in their 90s and even centennials, and you spoke with them about the time that they were still young.
Yeah.
And youth, the youthful spirit, the Indonesian semangat, is there in all kinds of. How were these conversations with people talking, and you sometimes describe that these memories were fading, but sometimes they are extremely vivid.
Yeah.
So
it was extraordinary talking to these people. One of the first interviews I did was with an elderly lady, and she was hospitalized. And when I found her, she was lying on a bed, and I thought, like, ooh, I don't feel comfortable here. I think I'm too late, and I should respect her old age. And she started talking. And kept on talking, I mean, for several hours. And she, as a 14-year-old, she had left Java, came from a broken family, was very much into the revolutionary semangat, joined the independence fighters on Kalimantan, sailed to Kalimantan, joined a local militia, first as what they call a Red Cross, so as a nurse and a cook, but then started to carry a weapon as well, and spent months living in the forest, being afraid of orangutans, running for the Dutch, sleeping on the ground, having hardly any food, trying to get food from local inhabitants. And she shared all these stories. I thought it was absolutely extraordinary. And these are voices which are not very often echoed in the archive, because the paper archive is very often a colonial archive. And if it's not a colonial archive, it's still an elite archive. So oral history was for me a great entry into history from below.
And this, in the end, results in many beautiful conversations that also will have yielded an enormous archive.
Yes, it is an archive as well.
Yeah. And what are you going to do with it? With the archive, because it's wonderful material. You went to Nepal. You talked to people that many people will not ever be able to talk to.
Right. Yeah.
What will happen with the David Van Reybrouck Revolusi archive?
I haven't asked myself the question yet, but obviously I keep these notebooks, I made some recordings, but not too many, because my experience is that people share less when there is technology listening, and I don't like recording in hiding. I don't think it's fair. But my notebooks are open for everyone who wants to consult them, for scholars, etc. I have a difficult handwriting, but I can read it, and so as long as I'm alive, I'm happy to decipher my own handwriting.
Great.
And a part of it has been filmed as well. Two Dutch documentary makers have been following me and have been recording a number of extraordinary interviews as well. So I'm quite happy. There's going to be a documentary on Dutch television about it. And so I'm very happy that some of the interviews have been recorded on tape as well.
Great. Well, that is of course very important, because I can imagine that many people are intrigued and inspired also by this enormous body of work that you have done, and the interviews.
Yeah.
And
it's 26 notebooks.
26 notebooks.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Wow.
And for Congo, I only had 11. I wrote a book on Congo before, and I had a lot of material then. And now the stack kept on piling up. But I thought, like, I'm in a lot of cases, I'm the last scholar who is going to talk to these witnesses. And in many cases, I was also the first scholar to go and talk to them. So I cherish this material, and I'm quite a sticky archivalist myself. I mean, I'm really aware of that this is valuable material. Yeah.
And you know, you said you have this history in academia, of course. Right. Do you have any plans of teaching based upon this material? Because I can understand that younger from the colonial, post-colonial diaspora, or younger people in general, are intrigued and are interested in learning about your method, your methodology, the questions, and sometimes also the problems that you encountered. Any plans, any offers from, for instance, your alma mater Leiden?
Not so far, but well, the book has just come out. Actually, I would love to make a podcast about it, because the reading is changing and listening is somehow replacing, and I think it would be interesting. Apart from having an audiobook, I'm keen to talk about it and starting to delve into the possibilities of making a podcast about it. I mean, I don't have any experience there, but it seems like an interesting new genre, which I would love to discover. I once did some teaching in Indonesia, but it was on one occasion. It was interesting to talk to second-year undergraduates in southern Sulawesi. That was fascinating in the Banda region. And I liked it. So, but there's many things I like.
So what did they ask? Because that is interesting. As perhaps as we move on, and in the meanwhile, I'm trying to revive the iPad that will send questions from our online audience, and we have a great team, Glenda and Armando, working on that. And I'm like Maxwell Smart, trying to.
It's working. You have a screen.
It's working.
Yeah.
Oh wow, that's great. Okay, this is again a wonderful question, and it's one that's even better than mine. It says that you were surprised by some of the outcomes of the book. Why and how? Because you're the author.
Right. Does the person ask what was the thing that surprised me most during writing the book?
Well, the next line, it says, what struck David the most during his investigations for his book? So,
many things. I must say, I got angrier and angrier as I was writing, and I was surprised by that. The attitude of Dutch political authorities, as I started to go into the details of what had happened during ministerial meetings here in The Hague, just not far away from Amsterdam where we're sitting now, I found them extraordinary in their psychological myopia, the sort of short-sightedness, and the lack of understanding, the sort of there has not been a lot of moments of encounters between Dutch and Indonesian people on an equal footing. And I think at one point I talk about in the book about the Lingajati conference, where for the first time people spoke amongst equals. And it was interesting, and the Dutch negotiators understood that things had to be approached differently. But unfortunately, back in Holland, when the compromise that was struck at the Lingajati agreement was taken back, and a sort of structural condescending attitude towards Indonesians, they're still children, they still can do this, they still need us. I think it was the other way around. Holland rather needed, the Netherlands needed Indonesia, but for economic and emotional reasons. But the sort of stubbornness, I mean, I can understand that it's not easy to let go a colony that's been so intimately tied up with the national history. I can understand that it was difficult in 45. I cannot understand that in 46, 47, when things were happening in the world, the Philippines were getting independent, India was becoming independent. I failed to see how this stubbornness becomes so structural and how it was challenged so little. And that was my biggest surprise. And so there's a growing awareness now of military misbehavior done by Dutch troops, and I'm grateful. I think it's important this comes to the surface. But I feel bad and uncomfortable with Dutch teenagers coming from Frisia or Zeeland and who were ignorant, ill-prepared, ill-trained, ill-equipped, being sent. I mean, if our indignation is only directed towards these 20-year-old Dutch soldiers without looking at the political responsibilities in The Hague to the highest level, we're missing something.
There you definitely have a point. At the same time, in your book, and you describe it very well, of course, the fact that Indonesian nationalist intellectuals, people who studied, who knew about the world, and it's great that you talk about the fact that Hatta went to Brussels in 27 to attend the meeting of the League Against Imperialism and Colonialism, where Albert Einstein, and that I didn't know, also attended. And this link that you make to world history,
right?
And this, I think, is one of the important points that you make in the book. That what happened in Indonesia is part of, or is world history. It's not part of world history. It is world history, and the Dutch had a hard time understanding.
And surprisingly, these young Indonesians who were studying in the Netherlands in the 1920s and the 1930s had a much more global outlook than Dutch politicians at the time. There's been a fantastic PhD done by Klaas Tetsche. I mentioned him several times in the bibliography on the international networks these 20-year-olds had. I mean, they were studying in Leiden or economics in Rotterdam, but they had contacts with people in India, with people in Germany, in Scandinavia. They had an incredible network. The whole idea that decolonization is just a movement that is vertical from a colonizing state and a colonized territory is so problematic if you don't look for the horizontal dimension. The colonized are not just caged within their colony. They do have international networks, and these networks turn out to be instrumental in building up an understanding of what's happening in the world. And I found it fascinating. And so not only in the 1950s, so I mean, I spent a lot of time on the Bandung conference, even before, even in the 1920s. And I was fortunate to interview one man, my oldest witness. He was 104 years old when he died. He lived in Callantsoog in the tip of North Holland. He had been here in the 1930s as a student, and his entire outlook was so international because he was a member of the famous Perhimpunan Indonesia, the Indonesische Vereniging. And the debates that were going on, it was seen as radical and communist and dangerous, but they had a worldview that surpassed, by and large, the worldview of most Dutch people and also of most Dutch politicians.
Yes. absolutely agree, and it's wonderful that many of them also thought and wrote in Dutch. Shahrir onze strijd, Hatta in 28, Indonesië moet vrij.
Yeah.
And as we move gradually to Jakarta,
Right.
because when we talk about intellectuals, when we talk about people who are global intellectuals, of course, when we talk about present-day Indonesia, we soon talk about Goenawan Mohamad.
Of course.
Who was born in 41, who is a prolific writer, journalist, artist, a wonderful painter, playwright, the founder of Tempo magazine, also the founder of Salihara Cultural Center in Jakarta. And already 5 years ago, the driving force behind the Indonesia as guest of honor program in the Frankfurter Buchmesse, which launched Indonesia in Germany. Many wonderful authors have been translated, and this is perhaps something that we can take up with Goenawan Mohamad. And for those of you who want to follow him on social media, he is on Twitter, GM, and when you're really famous, you only need 2 words, GM, or perhaps in David, DVR, enough. He has tens of thousands of people that follow his tweets, his short columns, catatan pinggir, sidelines have been translated in English, not in Dutch.
Yeah. He's a top intellectual. He's Indonesia's leading intellectual.
He is one of the best, and
Absolutely.
so we are very happy that he can join us for this occasion. And let's just look at the
There he is.
screen. Selamat malam. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
That's good. We are very happy that you can join us in Amsterdam. Unfortunately, you cannot join us on the stage, but we are definitely happy and privileged that you join us by Zoom. And if I may ask, Masgun, how are you doing in these trying times in Jakarta?
Well, it's very difficult because Salihara is technically closed, but I come here every day to be in my studio and do a lot of paintings. That's the way to have a protocol, kind of my protocol, to be isolated and work. Okay. But the pandemic is getting worse.
Well, that's very sad to hear. But Masgun, if I may, we are here with a small audience because of the pandemic, but also, of course, on the occasion of David Van Reybrouck's book, Revolusi. And what we would like to ask you, when we talk about the colonial history, and especially the 20th century colonial history, and you have been one of the people who have read, wrote, you did a lot of things pertaining that colonial history. What would you say is the present state of Indonesian understanding of that colonial history?
Well, first of all, let me congratulate David for the success of the book, and I wish I could get it soon. Maybe Wim can manage to send me one, and I can read it. And I will really want to see David and Wim together soon. But the pandemic has stopped all troubles. But still, to have this kind of meetings is wonderful. That's why when I was asked to come to join, I didn't think twice. Well, the question is about what people think about the colonial time. I was intrigued by what David said, that the Dutch were rather reluctant to talk about the past out of guilt and embarrassment. But in Indonesia also, when we talk about Revolusi, we don't talk about it. It's a myth. We have to explore more about it. That's why book like David produced is very important to be read here. A lot of myths about Revolusi and the word has a kind of aura. Every time people say the Revolusi, it means something good. But there are a lot of questions. What is really a revolution? When we talk about revolution, actually, most people talk about the independence war. David talked about it for 5 years. It was 5 years? Yeah, since the Aksi police action in 46. But there are other meanings of revolution used in a non-violent way, but in a very vague way. Maybe that's the best thing about revolution, is very vague. It's undefinable, like poetry. But then, how will it shape our perception about the past, about the colonial time? When it's based on myth, it's very contingent and very, 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 very unstable. Of course, we don't want to be to be colonized, but there are things that colonialism can do, produce in history. Among other things is to generate revolution. And revolution is kind of event that creates subject. I think Pramudia Anandatur in the book, Di Tepi Kali Bersakasi, mentioned about it. A young man called Farid, who was nobody, but when he joined the battle, he became a subject. And that's what revolution did to us. And the interesting thing is, we look more into ourselves, and as if there's no Dutch in our history, only in memories, but the very, very, very complicated memories. When you read Indonesian novels, even Pramudia, the Dutch is absent. And that's why we cannot really answer what kind of image we have about the past, about the Dutch. One thing is sure, for me, if I may continue this, the good thing about Indonesian nationalism is there are a lot of bad things, but the good thing is it was shaped by Marxism. And David mentions about the international connection, which Indonesian youth in the 1920s had. I think it was due to international movement of socialism. And then also we read colonialism not as a racial-based oppression, but well, if you believe in Marxism, it's class-based oppression. That's why it's not a permanent animosity. It's not natural. It's contingent, and that's a wonderful thing about the influence of Marxism in our national history. Did I answer you?
Yes, you definitely did, and thank you for that. And it is also in David's book that many of these young nationalists were influenced by socialism, by Marxism. When Bung Hatta was exiled on Banda, he read Das Kapital to study the world capitalism, basically. But you also mentioned, Mas Gun, the role of art and of literature. And David, in his book, mentions Afandi, mentions Khairul Anwar, the poet. How do you feel that the role of artists, of writers, of painters was in these times of revolution, of forging a new Indonesia?
Well, literature, like philosophy, is a bird that flies in the afternoon, in the evening. We write about things after what has happened. And that's why Khairul Anwar and Afandi, they didn't influence revolution, but the revolution influenced and shaped them. But there was a kind of chemistry between freedom and creation. And maybe that also explains why so much outburst of creativity after 45. But not because of the Dutch disappeared, but because the Japanese disappeared. The Japanese controlled the language, controlled expression. That's why after the Japanese gone, literary production was very, 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 very impressive.
Yeah.
But painting, yeah. The other day I went to Istana in Jogja. Maybe David has been there. And you have you been there, Wim?
Yes.
In the palace Jogja. There was a museum, paintings, all about the revolution. By Afandi, Heng Antung, and Sujoyono, of course. And you see how revolution was captured in the visual art. But only people like Sujoyono could really explore, express it very wonderfully. And there's something which it came together with modernism in the art. So the whole tradition of visual art in the past, even during the 30s, were undone. And the other thing I would like to add is, revolution has a lot of negative impact. And we don't know yet what kind of positive impact we have out of that, except that we have our independence. But one thing I noticed is the language. Indonesian language changed a lot from the previous era. So we, for example, the way we use boom, which I think originated from the Malukus. Ammonis call each other brother, and became Bung Karno, Bung Hatta. And that's not today we don't use Tuan and Nyonya, and we don't even drop words like Pujanga, and Pujanga is writer in an honorific way, and other things. When I was in Malaysia the other day, I was surprised that people there still use Patik to call himself or herself. In France, of the royal family, Patik was used in Indonesian only in the old Sandiwara and plays, the kings and princes. No more used. And the language has become very egalitarian. And that's created a lot of problem with the Javanese language. No wonder that there was a moment when people want to change the Javanese language into more egalitarian tone. Of course, it doesn't work.
Mas Gun,
pardon me?
Mas Gun, if I may, because what you are telling us is fascinating, and sometimes in the Netherlands we are also envious of Flemish speakers because their Dutch is basically more poetic and more beautiful. But I would like, David, do you have perhaps a question to ask to Mazgoen?
I do.
I have a question to David, but
That's even better.
Sure.
he is the one who wrote me.
Yes, you first, Mazgoen, you first.
Yeah. I was wondering, but maybe not only David can answer that. We talk about the war of independence, but actually, how many Dutch soldiers were killed during the war? When I was a kid, I knew there were 3 in my neighborhood because a guerrilla threw a grenade in the bivouac. But for the rest of the country, I don't know, maybe nobody was killed.
Right. There is.
And that's very important because it could also put the war of independence into the right perspective.
That's right. On the Indonesian side, there were casualties between 100,000 and 200,000. That's what people estimate. On the Dutch side, probably 5,000, but only half of them were killed in action. The others either died in accidents or from diseases. So about 2,500 people killed in action. 5,000 Dutch people have been buried there at the graveyards.
But this is soldiers, right?
Soldiers, excuse me, I'm talking about soldiers here, yes.
Oh, thank you. Also, they were buried here in Jakarta?
I think, yeah, several places. I have a question for you as well, Goen.
Yes, please.
Last time I was in Jakarta, I was intrigued to see in front of the museum the sort of colonial paraphernalia, people dressing themselves in colonial, riding Dutch bicycles, being dressed in colonial dresses. Is there a form of reenactment culture? What does it say about the colonial past if it become commodified in these sort of, you can have your photograph taken with an umbrella from 1900 and on an Oma bicycle from Holland, and what does it say about the way people or tourists deal with that past?
Oh, that's very interesting. I think human is an animal who can be bored, and we are bored with this reproducing thing, and we start having nostalgia of the past.
Yeah.
But why the past was the colonial past? Maybe from aesthetic reason, the dress, the architecture, they were all Dutch. And the other thing is that, again, we don't have any memories of hatred against the Dutch as people. No, it's true. The other day when I was in Holland, I was asked by Professor Theo, do you have some grudges and hatred against the Dutch? I was surprised that I never thought about it. We don't. And because he knew my father was executed by the Dutch. But I was educated not being anti-Dutch, but anti-colonialism. And I think many Indonesians were like that too. That's not because it's not ethnic-based nationalism, which was different from the new nationalism in Serbia or maybe in Africa. And I'm very happy to have that in Indonesia. Of course, then it's not perfect, and we have our own race hatred against the Chinese in the past. And bigotry is always hidden somewhere. But yes, we don't have any bad feeling about the Dutch people. And of course, we don't enjoy the food. But be enjoying the process. You know, Jakarta without your city was nothing, will be nothing. Not interesting. You know, even in Semarang, have you been to Semarang lately?
To where?
They renovated Semarang.
Semarang, yeah.
Yeah, they had, the old town was being renovated, and most of them are Dutch business buildings, and they're beautiful. And this kind of thing tells you about the way we remember the past.
Yes, Masgun, it's perhaps also Indonesia won, and then perhaps it's easier to be gracious. And I think, David, if you would go to Surabaya on November 10th, where they have these enactments, you would be recruited to play a Dutch soldier.
Yeah.
People would be very friendly, but you would be definitely put on display and be photographed.
Yeah.
But a Dutch, or in this case, as you describe in the book, it would be a British soldier. But who's counting? Masgun, thank you so much for taking the time this late at night to join us in the conversation. Hopefully, you will be able to stay with us and follow the program. But for now, and I'm very much looking forward meeting up again, looking at your wonderful paintings, and perhaps one very brief question, because as of late we see a new generation of Indonesian writers that engage with the colonial past. When Eka Kurniawan, Iksaka Banu, Ayu Laksmi, and others, Laila. Why is this?
Well, it's they don't have real memory about the period, so it generates a lot of possibility to create, and there are a lot of good stories about it. And actually, books like what David produced would be very helpful for a material for literature. There's going to be a book on maybe you are aware of it, the Chinese image of the Chinese in Dutch literature. It's going to be published next month. I wrote the forward, but it's a wonderful book, and there are a lot of stories about the Chinese which many Indonesians are aware, and a lot of materials to be written, for a play or for a story, because you need a lot of materials to write, and it's good that Ikas Banu is one who very, very productive about it. And I'm very happy with that. But of course, should be more good writing and not only a good story.
Thank you, Masgun, also for this tip, because any book that you write a foreword for is worthwhile reading, but first people have to read Revolusi, obviously. And again, thank you very much. Stay safe and healthy, and hopefully until sampai jumpa, until we meet again.
I would like to thank you, both of you. I really enjoy your presentation. I miss meeting you both. And the talk is very important for me. I will say.
Thank you.
We miss you too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Goenawan.
And now, after this, it's always inspiring and also humbling to be in a conversation with someone like Goenawan Mohamad. We moved to another place in Jakarta thanks to modern technology. Otherwise, it would take us hours in Jakarta traffic. It now only takes us one click with Zoom when we meet up with someone who's actually mentioned in your book. A mutual friend, Sadiah Boonstra, who's joining us. Hi, Sadiah. Good evening,
Hi.
malam malam. Sadiah Boonstra is a historian, did her PhD, did her MA in Leiden actually, but then moved to the Vrije Universiteit, did her PhD on Wayang as cultural heritage, and who is now working and living in Jakarta as a researcher, a curator. And Sadiah, you're mentioned in the book, you and David visited museums together. And so how does visiting museums play into research on the topic of Revolusi?
Are you asking me?
Hi.
Or
Yeah, the both of you can answer, yeah.
First of all, hi Wim, hi David. I'm so glad to be participating tonight and so glad to see you here. And congrats, David, on the launch of your book. It's great, it's a great read and I've been enjoying it very much. And while reading it, I often had to think back about our museums visits that we did in Jakarta. And I think we spent actually days just wandering around museums. And so we visited, for example, Museum Sejarah, Museum Nasional, the Textile Museum, almost all the museums in Jakarta, I think. A lot of the conversations were not just about the museums, but also about Indonesian history, about representation. I think we spoke a lot about representation, how things are represented in museums, in history, and how that could resonate in your book. And I do remember that those kind of things. So not necessarily anything in particular that I specifically remember, but all these very general conversations about history and the relationship also between the Netherlands and Indonesia. Yeah.
Now I have very good memories of the work we did together. But there was one thing that I really wanted to see and that you taught me about. It was in the Textile Museum, the Wayang Revolusi. That series,
yes.
Do you remember?
Yeah.
That series
yes,
of
yeah.
Wayang.
In the Wayang Museum, actually.
In the Wayang Museum. A series of puppets made during the War of Independence, where you do not see the classical figures from the classical epic poetry. But here you had Dutch colonizers and the governor general and a Dutch soldier and a local Tuan, and so I really wanted to see this. And I took a lot of pictures in that museum. And when I was writing that passage in the book, I went back to my pictures to see what they represented. But it was useful. We also visited one or two witnesses together. It was obviously it's always great to share experiences where you're doing research, and we had a good time. It was wonderful to travel through Indonesia together and spend some hours in the traffic jams in Jakarta.
Yes. Yeah, so it's wonderful to see that, you managed to do the work and actually, write the book. And so congrats on that.
Thank you.
If I may ask, while in the Wayang Museum, when you were visiting, did you also looked at and pondered about the tombstone of Jan Pieterszoon Koen?
I saw
that
it.
is also there.
Yeah,
right?
On the very spot. The museum is built on the place where he was buried. It's still there in a courtyard. Feels very strange, I have to say. I mean, you don't know whether it's there as an object in a museum or as a monument. It's still there. It's legacy loaded with emotions and ambivalence and meaning, and it's somehow tucked away in that museum, strangely enough. Yeah,
it is. David and Sadiah, you read the book, and David has this wonderful metaphor of the ship. In this case, the Van Wijk that met a terrible fate, but people have to read it to learn more about the fate, but also the fact that David uses the metaphor of these different levels of the ship as a symbol of colonial society that is based upon difference in many, many ways, not only socially, economically, but also judicially. Was that something that struck a chord with you, or how these differences, also legal apartheid, was there in David's book?
Yeah, I was thinking about that actually, and I did find in first instance I thought like it was a very clever find, and then later in your bibliography I read that that was actually a metaphor that was more often used to sort of like explain the hierarchy in colonial society in Indonesia. I was wondering actually, because also now when Mas Gun was actually saying that there is not really, there are not really hate feelings, very vibrant hate feelings amongst Indonesians against the Dutch because nationalism was not ethnic based. But I was actually wondering, because you do mention that in the decks of the ship, of course, throughout colonial society, you do mention that there is racial discrimination, and race every so often pops up, but it's largely something that I have to read in between the lines. So I was actually wondering, David, you know, to what extent you actually wanted to make a point to show the racism that was so deeply embedded in colonial society.
The metaphor of the ship with the several decks for me was useful because there was obviously colonial society is a divided society. It's a society with precisely allocated spaces for different sorts of people. But the metaphor of the deck for me was useful because it was more than about race, and it was more than about class. There was some form of, it's different from apartheid South Africa, for instance, where racial discrimination imbued every aspect of social life. Whereas here in the Dutch colonial context, some people could move from deck 3, where the Indonesian masses were, to deck 2. And some people on deck 2, sort of middle class deck, could move on to deck 1. There was a form of social mobility, very limited, very frustrating for those who climbed it. You would think like these are the happy ones, but once you reached deck 1 from deck 2, you'd notice that you were not quite part of deck 1 yet. And I found the metaphor interesting because it allowed to talk about social divisions that were not just class, not just race, but societal divisions. Chinese people were both on deck 1, deck 2 and deck 3. Indische Nederlanders, the so-called Indos, another term whether you can wonder whether it's still useful or not, were on deck 1, deck 2 and were not allowed to go to deck 3. So there's a lot of, the divisions are not entirely social, they're not entirely racial, but they're quite spatial, and I thought the metaphor of the deck allowed me to explain that complexity. And it's a metaphor I found, I mean, I was doing research on the Van der Weyck, that ship that sunk and had a lot of victims on board, and I started checking the old newspapers, and I said, oh, wow, if there's one place where colonial society, where the divisions of social society materialized, it was on board of these ships. People sat together for hours, even days, sailing together, and there you saw the social divisions of that society. And it was only gradually I started to delve into this. This is really interesting, this is a good metaphor. And then I found an article that somebody had suggested that metaphor somewhere in the 1990s already. So, and he had done some great research as well. Yeah.
And so Sadiah, what else struck you when you were reading David's book? Did you find anything that was, well, surprising or perhaps contradicting things that you are working on or thinking of? Because obviously, as we agree, we also have to be able to disagree, because otherwise we don't have a debate and everybody's just cheering. And we have these ceremonial sessions sometimes where, for instance, in Indonesia, everybody is very happy and everybody is applauding, and at the end you're none the wiser. So what is your take? Because you read David's book, you've been involved in also part of the research. What is also the relevance of Revolusi for you, but perhaps also for fellow historians and curators that are working in Indonesia right now?
Perhaps I thought more about it in terms of audience, maybe not necessarily in usefulness or in that sense, but I was thinking it in terms of audience. And David already mentioned earlier, and that's actually how the book came across to me, that the book seemed to me to be written to address a Dutch audience. It seems to be written to sort of right the wrongs of the Dutch in the past and create awareness amongst the Dutch about what happened, not just during Revolusi, but also, you know, in the previous colonial times. So that was something that I thought, like, yeah, this is a book for Dutch audiences. I'm not really quite sure, you know, if it's actually a book for Indonesian audiences. I think a book that would have been written from an Indonesian perspective might have looked slightly different, in the sense that I think it's still valuable for Indonesian readers, for sure. I mean, it's a very interesting read, and the work that you've done, it has brought together so much knowledge about the colonial times and about the Revolusi time, that it's really, you know, an overview of Indonesian history, but it's not from an Indonesian perspective, I think. I mean, there are, of course, all the stories that we read, the interviews that you've done, but I was sometimes wondering, you know, could you have used other sources, for example, for the late colonial period in the 1920s and 1930s, maybe letter exchanges between Hatta, Sukarno, you know, and take their perspectives as a starting point for this story. Whereas sometimes I still now feel that, you know, it's still a story from a European Anglo-Saxon perspective, or from that framework, because most of the knowledge that was produced about, you know, Indonesian history was created within that framework. So, yeah, how was that? Was that an actual choice, or I understand, you know, that maybe language might also have been a barrier, but I sometimes felt like it would have been nice also to have the story told from an Indonesian perspective.
So basically, I hear two or perhaps even three questions. David, did you have any audience or potential readers in mind when you were writing?
I definitely had more than a Dutch audience in mind, for the simple fact that I'm not Dutch, and I was hoping that people in my country were going to read it. And even beyond that, I think one of the reasons why I stress that the Indonesian history of independence is world history is also because I believe that people should know about this. I hope that people in the US will read it. I hope people in France will read it. I hope that Japanese people will read it. But Sadiah is right. I mean, it's undeniable. I am not Indonesian. My perspective is obviously biased from the point that I'm writing from. I am a Belgian author. I am who I am. What I try to do is to challenge my perspective on a permanent basis by inviting in voices that I would not normally hear. One of the reasons I do these interviews is not only because it is interesting and intense to go and travel to places and to hear people you would never hear, but also because their view opens my mind and tries to takes me out of Belgium, takes me out of Europe, gives me a perspective that I wouldn't get otherwise. But it is true that I was struck when I was in Indonesia that, well, two things. First, there is not such a thing as the Indonesian perspective. I mean, it's the fourth biggest country on the world. So let us not believe there is such a thing as a monolithic local perspective. It's not local. It's a highly diverse society. Second thing, book reading is not as big as it is here, or we are perhaps becoming more Indonesian in now that we are reading less. There's not a lot of bookshops. I didn't see a lot of people reading books. The very idea of producing a history book is perhaps something quite Western, and people who do read books and who still read them in Indonesia, people like Goenawan Mohamad, we just heard before, are people who have close contacts with what's happening in Europe. So there is obviously, I didn't see a lot of people reading big books in Indonesia, but still that should not stop other people from writing them. I think it's valuable, and I would feel a little bit sorry for a world in which only Peruvian activists can write about Peruvian activism. I do believe that a global dialogue is possible and necessary, and I believe that books are one form of it, but I just said I would love to make a podcast, and perhaps podcasts are a nicer way. Having English streaming programs is another way of sharing knowledge. But it is true, although there are much more people living in Indonesia than in the Netherlands, I believe that more Dutch people will read the book than Indonesians will, because of the book reading culture there.
On that note, perhaps a very brief question in between. You've talked to so many people, talked about very intense and also traumatic experiences in their lives. What is then your position, or perhaps I should even say responsibility? You leave. And sometimes it's very hard to be in contact with these people again if they're living in Nepal and in very isolated areas. How do you deal with that responsibility that they've shared with you?
Yeah, it's something I struggle with myself as well. People give me their story, and I try to be a good custodian of that narrative. But I keep on wondering, did I do them justice? Did I portray them the way they would have portrayed themselves? That for me, it's a friend of mine is a photographer, and he tells me like every time I take a portrait, there's a moment of intimacy, and then I go home and I work on the picture, and then it's printed, and it's like you're taking the distance from the person. I recognize that procedure very, very much, and it's difficult. I try to make sure that what I write is something that can always be read by the person. Sarcasm is not my style. Irony is not my style. I'm not there to debunk people, to destroy their public image, their sense of self. I try to be highly respectful of that. But it's difficult, and in some cases I can hand a copy of the book. I'm looking forward to see the book published in Indonesia and to be able to give it to people I interviewed themselves. But with a number of people I know that we'll never be able to reach them anymore because they live in very remote places, and most of them, I think half of the witnesses I spoke to have died between the moment that I interviewed them and now. And that's a sorry feeling. At the same time, people also told me like just the fact that you are here to listen to my story is meaningful. People have a lot of emotions, and Goenawan just said like the Revolusi has become a myth, and that myth has become very monolithic. And there's not a lot of room for individual pain within that myth. We won, so we are the happy winners of that story. And a lot of people told me like, well, there was one man in southern Sulawesi who told me every year I need to go to this ceremony, and they take me with a car, and at the end I have to walk home, and they have given me a new t-shirt, and it's all the cheering, like we won. But he said like, I don't want to talk about it. For me, he was crying when he was giving his testimony. And I don't think that person will still be able to get the book in time. He was very old and elderly. But I had the impression that the moment itself was an important moment of truth, and I hope that the sharing of his story. But it is something that bothers me as well. Something I struggle with. I think of these people. In the book, they're just names. In my mind, they're individuals. They're people.
Sadiah, if you hear David sharing his feelings and his thoughts, of how history sometimes becomes monolithic, state-controlled, where there is hardly any room for... Is this something that you also recognize? And if so, in your practice, how do you deal with this situation?
Yeah, I think that's definitely, you know, a thing also connected to what Mas Gun was saying earlier about that there is not a lot known by the general public about the period of Revolusi or about colonial history in general, I would say. So there is still a very big challenge for historians in Indonesia, historians writing on Indonesian history, to rectify that. And I think part of that is a result of these very strong nationalist frames that have been that we've had in the past during Sukarno and then Suharto, that were so, the political frameworks were such that they became like straight jackets for writing history. So that's something that we need to rectify, and we need to write new histories. So that is not something that we're gonna achieve overnight. It's something that needs probably decades, because we need to unlearn so many things about thinking about nationalism. It means we have to really critically look at history and the sources that we have and reassess those sources and rethink history. So that is a lot that I encounter in my work, and that I really love about my work, is that I like to, you know, see what is there, what are people here, Indonesians, inlanders, inheemse mensen, actually doing, and what do they think about history, what part have they played in history, and how are they actually dealing with that history in the present for their future? Because a lot of younger generations, they are also looking for an identity, because the history that they've been learning at school was never a history that wasn't actually history. It was always propaganda. So everyone is now looking at, you know, at their own history to understand who they are as an Indonesian. So it's kind of also about maybe finding a new form of citizenship, finding a new way for how to be Indonesian in Indonesia today. Mm-hmm. And I like working with artists and artists, visual artists, performing artists, to basically explore what else is there beyond the colonial framework, beyond these nationalist frameworks that are still there, and create art and knowledge for another future.
But it's interesting.
Hello?
Historical, is it okay? Is the sound fine?
Yes, and we, could you very briefly, because we are, well, it's not as bad as in Indonesia, but we are running a bit out of over time, but, and Sadiah already made this wonderful transition to artistry. But you have a brief comment.
Very, very brief. We seem to think like we are doing fine with history. Indonesians are not interested enough in their history. And that might be problematic. Europe is now obsessed with history, and this is very recent and very unique. And great parts of the world does not seem to care a lot about history, and especially if it's presented to them in the form of propaganda, as it is the case in Indonesia. So Europe is perhaps more the exception, and Indonesia is perhaps more the normalcy here. This is what I wanted to add.
Thank you, David. And thank you also, Sadiah, also for providing the bridge to the next part of our program, which is a wonderful performance by Robin Block with visual storyteller Jeremy Flohr. It's part of a 5-series performance called The Manual for the Displaced, and the first performance is titled Jakarta, and Robin will introduce the second performance, and in order for the performance to really blossom, I have to leave. Briefly, I, as MacArthur, will return.
snippets flakes from your hair, Jakarta. 400 years of old skin withers like dry leaves. Black water flushes out of your harbor. The prayer begins. You awake, I'm boiling, the sheets are soaked. There's a dagger floating up in the air. Crisp saccharine standing on its tip is pressing holes in my skin. Little red dots start to itch. Go check, shoot like cheap chucks for your veins. Your cells fill up with sunlight, fill up with ashes. The blood flows faster and faster as the day ripens between your spines. Lamb, scalpel, needle. The doctors look at you worriedly today from behind their mouth caps. A cockroach crawls on its back, its little paws in the unforgiving air are dizzy. Nearly covered up as the floor and the ceiling are spinning in opposite directions. Tiny soldiers with little tails are creeping past the paintings, lurking at them from the strangest angle. Stick out your tongue like a hopeful patient. Stick out your tongue as a sign of life. Everybody is waiting. You and I don't have one another kindly, getting ready for big operation. Jakarta! Lalu lintas macet. This is traffic jam. Cardiac arrest. Your heart fried in concrete. Machines grinding around you. Your ideas as this moment. Still mumbling about the old days. I wrap myself into a banana leaf, trying to sleep. My skin is getting weak. Ants crawl between my toes. They lift me up and carry me to this steaming road. Back to your respirator. Sweat fires like bullets from your forehead, clinging to infusions of lapa muda. The air conditioning Toyotas to the mall overruns to the shiny floors of your shopping malls, from the lobbies and hotels, back to my sultry bed. Are you listening to the sound of crickets and sirens? The tinny tak of the last kaki lima. The girls giggling in their palms. The creaky lamentation of the old imam. I'm trying to hear voices between all of that rumble to fill my lungs without coughing. All that dust in my mouth. Jakarta. I'm trying to love you. Red flames burn in my chest. And whatever stroke of the gong, I shudder. This poem has Wim already pointed out, part of a project called Menu for the Displaced, and I was very happy with Sadiah's last words, because we take our inspiration from the Dutch music colonial history, but at the same time, as a third generation, we also try to make this story more universal. So many of these pieces are about displacement or the sense of belonging, or how survival, strength, or trauma transfers over different generations. And the next piece is actually the premiere of our second chapter, or video, so to say, with lovely, with the dancers as dictators and great images by visual storyteller Jeremy Flohr. And it's called Jangan Do Not Forget. And that was the name of a sort of household book for many people that came after the Indonesian independence in the Netherlands. And it tells you how to run a household, but it does not tell you how to make a home. So that's what we try to do with this video. You must learn how to move under skies that darken your skin. Learn how to read all numbers in a long, flat street. Those leafless trees will someday bear fruit. Carve your name in the threshold. There is a door. Cloak your fugitive thoughts. Brush your barefoot through the hallway and cold floors. A cloth covers the other table as you neatly fold your tongue and place it in closed drawers. Nail your hands to the wall where a garden, jasmine bloom. An old gold hole so the light passes through. If you squint your eyes, the colors will brighten. The smell of fresh paint in a half-bleeding neighborhood. Pile of stones where the children act out war. Bless the Lord, for there is food. Pale flesh, potatoes. And there are tricks to peel the skin of anything. The trunk keeps its lips shut. Roaming the attic at night. Grandfather's portraits saluting you, old friends smiling in black and white. Curling round the pillow, dozing off. Sometimes the light will cleanse the room. You stretch with your mouth wide open. Sometimes the furniture retreats. You catch yourself standing still, like some mute animal. Sometimes you walk backwards down the stairs to the basement, always skipping the step that's missing.
Displays with wonderful images of visual storyteller Jeremy Flohr. And we are very happy that we are now joined at the stage with our last guest, Amanda Pinati, who is a curator of design at the Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam, also a co-founder of a design museum in Mumbai, which is a wonderful topic to talk about. Perhaps it definitely warrants a separate session, I would say. But in this setting, we have asked you, and thank you for coming out on such short notice, as a representative of a younger generation. to engage with us in a conversation. How do you feel books like Revolusi that are coming out can play a role in the way that younger people, especially from post-colonial diasporas, engage with this history of colonialism, of post-colonialism, of present-day issues that are rooted in colonial history? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me, by the way. I think a younger generation is becoming more critical than the previous generations, and that's of course not surprising, because a first generation that arrived here after the independence war, they had to assimilate, like Robin actually just very beautifully visualized. Second generation saw how their parents were struggling with trauma, and they actually really wanted to fit in. But I think this third generation, or a bit younger generation, maybe feels a bit more distance to that memory. They live that memory a bit differently, and they become more curious, they become more critical, and they actually are not afraid to look at the colonial history and actually really denounce it. But as you said, the diaspora here is very diverse. There is the Indische people, but of course Molokkan, Papuan, and there's all these different voices. Everyone looks at this at the history in different perspectives, and I think that's so important to have all those different voices. And that's also with the book. You also have different voices in your book, and we should listen to all of them, and then we can sort of recover our own history.
Mm. And when we talk about these different voices, they are different. David already mentioned Jeffrey Pondag, together with Lisbeth Zegveld, playing an important role in basically acting as a crowbar, really forcing the state to acknowledge what it has done, ordered people to do, right? And so how, for many people, activists like Jeffrey, and Tante Siska Patipilohi, whose words are at the very end of the book, is of course also very critical towards things that are going on, the research, and hopefully we'll be able to talk about this. How do younger people, like yourself, look at the role of these activists when it comes to opening up these discussions?
Yeah, I think it's very important because they unlock a certain history. We were talking about education. Myself in high school, I had 6 years of history, but the thing was that lots of attention was put on the history of the VOC, of the East Indies Company, the Golden Age.
And in what sense? The positive sense? The
positive sense, of course. We talked about the Golden Age, something that Imara Limon, curator of the Amsterdam Museum, also wants to get rid out of the vocabulary, because for whom was it a Golden Age? Definitely not for the people that were colonized. And then maybe only 2 pages were about the police actions. So this is what we've learned, that's what we know. So these books and these activists are very important for us to know what actually has happened. We did not learn that the ideology of independence already started in 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, became stronger, and it was not something suggested by the Japanese in 1942. We have never learned about the importance of the Conference of Bandung. So yeah, I think we are actually sort of learning our own history and where we're coming from. And
now, and David and also mentioned this before, many people say, well, younger people, a book like this, they might say, you know, it's a cool title, but it's like 500 plus pages. Is that actually true? Or is that just one of these myths that elderly people, elderly people like to complain about younger people?
I think people here in the Netherlands are young people, maybe actually in a global way, they're reading way and way more. The book clubs have, really? It's a whole new trend actually again. There's so many more book clubs now.
Am I hip?
Maybe you are. And I think what you said, like starting a podcast, I think if you actually connect the two, it's a very interesting way. And yeah, it's not, the young generation doesn't only watch Netflix, you know, we are very critical, and now we're talking to people across the world via Zoom. I mean, young people have been doing this for a while through WhatsApp, through platforms, maybe even like Tinder, you know. So I think we do read books, yes.
Well, Tinder, that must appeal to you.
It does. I was on Tinder when doing this research. I found a number of the witnesses. I mean, I was looking for a way to contact as many people as possible, like, do you have a grandfather or a grandmother who lived that age? And the best tool to use was basically Tinder. When I was in Indonesia and in Japan, I had a profile, one in Bahasa Indonesia, one in Japanese, saying like, I'm sorry, I'm not interested in you, but I'm interested in your grandfather or grandmother. And I'm very democratic because I accepted everybody. Male, female, young, old, living nearby or hundreds of kilometers away. I took everybody. I swiped mercifully in the right direction, and it was fantastic. I mean, it created some confusion, but it also created some possibility, and it was interesting. It was a good way. But it's interesting what you say, and I'm obviously happy to hear that people are still reading. But the fact whether people are reading or not should not be the argument for writing a book or not. And coming back to what Sadiah just said, it's true. I mean, there's not a lot of bookshops in Indonesia. There's not a lot of reading culture. But that should not stop people from writing books on Indonesia. It's such an important history, and it should be known in Indonesia and beyond. And here as well, I mean, I'm happy to hear that young people are reading, but I would have written this book even if they weren't. So I'm only learning this now. To my surprise, I have to say.
Well, actually, I think people in Indonesia are reading a lot of literature.
Yeah.
They like fiction a lot, but
That's
of course you're bummed out if history is only taught as national state history.
Exactly.
That would basically bum everyone out.
That's what I meant.
And I'm actually, when I read your story about using social media, I was immediately thinking that there must be a circle of people who were communicating, who is this creepy guy who wants to hook up with our grandparents, right? So that is, but it worked. But Amanda, you're a curator, right? And I'm interested in your curatorial practices, because what is happening now, and this is happening all over Europe, in the West, of course, there is this discussion on what to do with colonial collections. In the Netherlands, there was a government-instigated commission that came out with a report that basically said everything that is loot, in principle, needs to go back. And we have had visits in Dutch museums, but not only in the Netherlands, by a Belgian activist. Going to the Afrika Museum in Bergendal and basically taking away an object, saying, well, it's ours. And it makes for wonderful footage.
It was a beautiful action, because it opened people's eyes, and I'm very happy that report is there now that you just mentioned. So unconditional return, and Dutch museums won't be empty, you know, if all the really important pieces will be returned. We'll still have lots and lots and lots of objects here in the collections. And I think that's actually very important, that we look at these objects in a different light, with a younger generation, because we can say that these colonized objects, they are also objects in diaspora, and the people are also in diaspora. So I think if you put them together, you can create a whole new story.
I had an incredible story when I interviewed Joop Hutting, the whistleblower, and he had told me, like, during the military campaigns, he had taken a prayer book, an Islamic prayer book from a mosque or a sacred space where he was with the troops. And after he passed away, his daughters gave that prayer book to me, which is in Arabic characters. And it sits uncomfortable on my shelf. And my first idea was I tried to figure out where it was taken from and bring it back to Indonesia. And I had a talk about this with Sadiah. And Sadiah said, because the book is damaged as well, the front pages are gone, etc. And she said, like, I don't know where the future of this book is. First reaction would be bring it back to Indonesia. But there's so many layers of meaning that have become piled upon this object. She also said, like, it's also a book on Dutch military behavior in Indonesia. And then coming from the man who has been the first one to speak out on what he has seen and in what he has participated. So there's lots of layers there, and it's quite hard to find. I'm struggling. If anyone has a good suggestion, I'm interested to hear it. Somebody suggested there's this opening, there's this museum in the Rijksmuseum soon, which is a temporary exhibit in a couple of years. Perhaps it should be shown there, which I think is an interesting option.
Exactly. But also it might be interesting to see how a younger generation of artists react to this book, and how they might tell that story that you're just talking about, how they could visualize that.
And Amanda, how do you employ the work of artists? And of course, I've once heard a curator say, well, we should also be careful not to have artists do our work. In the sense that, you know, we're too chicken to basically address very sensitive topics, and then we bring in an artist.
Exactly. Now
but how do you do it?
So I work at the Stedelijk Museum now since February, and exactly what you're saying, I'm really critical about its history, so I first want to know everything about it. So I started a werkgroep in Indonesië, so a research group about the colonial institutional history together with my colleague Britte Sloothaak, and we're actually investigating the exhibition history of the Stedelijk, because in 1901 there was a huge exhibition, it's called the Indische exhibition, and in 1900 was the World Exhibition in Paris, and the Dutch had a colonial pavilion, and people here in the Netherlands thought it was such a shame that not all the Dutch people could go to Paris and see these wonderful objects that built their nation state. So they decided to ship everything to Amsterdam and show it in the Stedelijk Museum. But then in so it's really interesting that it sort of glorified the nation state within this museum. But then in 1947, there was an exhibition on the Jaya brothers. So Otto and August Jaya, they were here in Amsterdam in the time of the Independence War to really promote Indonesian independence. And they did that through their artworks. So these artworks, we have some in the collection. It's these Javanese mythologies. You see these warriors, they are fighting a red monster. And of course, that red monster is the colonial oppressor. And now there's two works by Jennifer Tay in the exhibition, The Presence of Absence, and she really investigates her personal relationship between, her Indonesianness, but also her Dutchness. So I think that, you know, the relationship of the Stedelijk with Indonesia really changed in that whole century, and that's something that we really want to, research, and then also see how this history can be relevant now for this generation, and then I would invite some artists to react to that history. So, but first be really aware of it ourselves.
Yes, and of course here in this very space, earlier this year, there was this wonderful exhibition on colonial gardens that was curated actually by Sadiah, and had wonderful and very strong work by contemporary Indonesian artists, also engaging with colonial history. Because next year, of course, we will be commemorating 400 years of genocide on Banda. And there was this very strong work by Ipe Noor that really was in your face. There was nothing romantic or whatever to it. And David, to make this comparison, right, with the use of art in ethnographic museums, but also in art museums, when you were visiting museums in Indonesia, in Jakarta, what was the narrative? Was there any narrative on those traumatic periods?
My impression was that there was not a lot of room for trauma and much more for triumph. That doesn't mean that trauma is absent. It is there, but it's not become part of the national narrative. If you've won, the wounds are rather hidden from sight. It's something. The triumph is celebrated collectively, and the wounds are being dealt with individually. That was my strong impression. Luckily, we were just talking about this historiographical or historical awareness here, how unique it is in Europe. I found it interesting to see how artists are dealing with history in different ways than academically. And in my bibliography, there's a lot of historians, also Indonesian historians. But in my word of thanks, in my acknowledgements at the end, there's people like Goenawan and Sadiah and Laksmi Pamuncak, because I learned a lot from talking to Indonesian artists, that there's a different way of dealing with the past rather than strictly academic, which I think is quite nice. At the same time, and now I'm contradicting myself, we should be careful not to turn artists into the priests of the 21st century. There's this idea that artists have like a deeper understanding or a deeper knowledge or a deeper awareness. And let's be careful not to create a new elite or a new clergy, an artistic clergy. So I'm saying two things. I love working with artists. I think they have opened my own eyes. At the same time, let's not elevate them to a point where they do not feel comfortable.
Amanda, this calls for a response, because you are, of course, engaged with the Stedelijk Museum, that used to be a temple,
Exactly.
if we use that analogy. But how is the Stedelijk, and how are you in your work, and with your fellow curators, how are you dealing with these issues?
Yeah, so of course the first thing that we acknowledge is that the museum was born in modernity, and there would be no modernism without colonialism. But I think what we're really looking for is a book of, how many pages was it? 500, 700?
I didn't count them. I only counted words.
It's very interesting, and it's one way of transferring knowledge. But what I think in the museum that always want to say, well, we have the power to convey knowledge, but that we do that in a different way. So I think though artists can come up with different ways of transferring knowledge. And that's so important right now. And I think we have to share, as a museum, we have to share authority with people that can do that. That can really
especially
reach.
the state, like the place where young artists have been given a place for the past decade. So
Yeah.
it seems logical there. It's just I take issue, and not with what the Stedelijk is doing, but I take issue with this idea that artists, if you work with local artists, the colonial experience is represented, or the perspective of people living in the former colonies, and that I found sometimes a bit essentialistic, as if one individual or a couple of individuals can translate the diversity of a national experience through one exhibit or something like that.
That obviously is always problematic,
Yeah.
and you started by saying, this
So many
diaspora
different
is
voices,
so
yeah.
diverse.
Exactly.
And so if from your personal point of view, then it's always good to make it personal, because then you're not burdened with the fact that you speak on behalf of whoever.
Yeah.
If you look at the history of the Netherlands and Indonesia, and how it resonates in present-day Dutch society, how perhaps ways of the different decks on the ship still resonate perhaps in our society. What is your take? How do you see that? Are there colonial echoes?
I think so. I mean, if we just look at what happened with the whole Zwarte Pieten discussion, I mean, that is certainly an echo from colonial times, from racism that has its roots there. So it's definitely still present. But I think we are opening our eyes more and more right now. And I really see that instead of maybe getting a seat at the table, we are just creating new tables for ourselves. So, yeah.
That's a wonderful way of putting it. Just not be content with a seat at a table, just making new tables for yourself.
But is there still communication with that first table?
Well, I was very surprised that I became the curator of design at the Stedelijk, for instance. I am very happy with that. I had an idea that they would probably go for someone a bit more older maybe, but I got that seat at the table. So if I also create another seat at the table,
but that is great.
I can be at many tables. Yeah.
That's right, but that is great. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. There's a diversity of perspectives, and many voices have never been heard. But I would be a little bit wary of a movement which moves to the quite opposite direction, where society becomes completely fragmented into sub-communities that do not talk to each other anymore. At the end of my book, I end with the climate challenge that lies ahead of us. We will have to be able to form one big table again sooner or later. Because I think if humanity is not successful in having a dialogue across identities, if we get stuck in a sort of fossilized experience of our private identity, we're losing something. And so how do we make tables, how do we get enough tables, and how do we make sure that tables keep on talking to each other? That seems to me a big challenge.
But then I think you should reread your book, because in your book, the cosmopolitan, the international outlook of these young Indonesian nationalists, of these artists, is very, very inspiring.
Yeah.
And it needs to be recovered and rediscovered and rekindled. And as Amanda, I think the Stedelijk needs you more than you need the Stedelijk, actually. So they did a good job by having you in the museum. And again, we could continue our conversation for hours, I guess, but there are always these practical concerns, and there are people coming in with questions. And one important question from the first session was actually a very practical question. Will there be a version of this book for educational purposes?
Very good. It would be like a shortened version, or I know with my book on Congo, it was used. I hope. My biggest hope is that this book will be read by teachers, and that they might use it in their classroom. Okay. And with my Congo book, there's textbooks in Belgium, for instance, now that use parts of the testimonies from the Congo book into the textbook. So it's much shorter, it's half a page or 2 pages. I'm always, for me, that's one of the biggest compliments I can have. I know that there's been contacts for an Indonesian translation. There's been the rights have been sold to 4 countries already, but this is still for the readership at large. I would love to see knowledge spreading to different layers and making it available for younger people. Again, I see myself as a sort of bridge between academic knowledge and a readership, a wider readership. But I'm always happy to see people carrying forward insights and enriching them with their own perspectives. There
are so many questions. We could actually do a separate session on the questions, but there is one that I would like to put forward. It is from someone who has heard, or think she or he has heard, that Belgium was a better decolonizer than the Netherlands. Did you say that, David?
I said that in terms of you see how words get twisted, don't you?
I'm just asking.
I think in terms of colonization, the Dutch did better than the Belgians. In terms of decolonization, the Dutch did worse than the Belgians. There was a war, and it costed more than 200,000 lives probably. There was not a war at the decolonization of Belgian Congo. I don't think that one would have won a beauty contest either, but at least it was not a war. So that's what I said in that context.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying, and thank you also for bringing in Patrice Lumumba when you talked about Bandung, right? And just as a final remark, because we are running out of time, you end the book with Tante Siska Patipilohi, who's actually saying that, well, if we look at the way that things developed, because one might say Bandung was the peak. Everyone was looking at Indonesia as one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement of the New World. Sukarno was with Nasser and with Nehru and with basically everyone. And then things go terribly wrong in the 60s. There's the biggest trauma, of course, of the mass killings that happened in 65, 66. Laxmi Pamuntjak's Red, Ahmad Tohari and many others have written very moving and telling novels and short stories about this. And she says, well, in the end, Tante Siska Patipilohi says, we are not yet free. Why did you took those words as the end words of a book?
Of a chapter.
Of the chapter, but it's the last chapter, right?
Because it bridges to the epilogue.
Yeah.
I think it was very interesting and very important what she said. For her, colonialism was a dramatic excess of capitalism, and she made the link between another excess of capitalism, it's climate change. I thought extraordinary that a 94-year-old lady in Amsterdam told me, like, we had more than 300 years of lagging behind because we had been colonized for such a long time. It was very, very hard. The adversary was stronger, and they have won. And it's true, the neo-imperial logic has installed itself throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We're still fighting for the values of Bandung right now. She said, like, capitalism has prevailed. We tried to change it. We failed. Capitalism has prevailed. And look at the tropical rainforest on Kalimantan. Look at Sumatra. Have you been there? This is literally what she said. Have you seen what has happened? So she made the connection of the damage done by capitalism in a colonial context and the damage done by capitalism in an environmental context. And that for me was a very important link, and that's the main message of the epilogue.
Very wise words of a very wise person.
Absolutely, yeah.
Amanda, are these issues also that the Stedelijk, as an art museum, or what used to be a classic art museum, is also engaging with?
It's actually quite funny, because it is. I'm working on an exhibition with a colleague about materials, and how designers are now so much more interested in coming up with new materials, but it's because of climate change, because the global sources are diminishing, and that is, and I'm also linking that to colonialism, because climate change has its roots in colonialism, but we also have to think about climate justice, and I would like to also speak with activists in that sense, and yeah, so I definitely link that and see that, yeah.
So thank you. That's a wonderful way to conclude this part of our session, and actually the entire session. And hopefully, Tante Siska Patpilohi will be able to come to the event and the exhibition to see that people are working, being aware of these continuities and these links between structural inequalities and structural problems, but also with people that are from a younger generation that are working on that. And on that note, on a positive note, and I'm now looking at the audience, and thank you for all the questions, and apologies for the fact that we were not able to accommodate all your questions. There were many. I hope you still say, I like, so I pay. Pay as you like, but do pay. Of course. First and foremost, on behalf of the organizers, so Beyond Walls, Framer Framed, and Read My World, I would like to thank all our guests. First and foremost, David, of course, Amanda, who's sitting opposite of me, and from Jakarta, Masgun and Sadiah Boonstra. Thank you so much for being with us. Also to you in the audience in this beautiful space of Framer Framed, who joined us, being very attentive and quiet. Thank you so much. The stream will be available on the different platforms, on Facebook, but also on the YouTube channel, the Facebook of the 3 participating partners, and on the YouTube channel of Framer Framed. So be sure to check it out, and be sure to also tell to your friends, colleagues who could not join us live, that they definitely would miss out on a special event if they wouldn't watch. And for friends in Indonesia, selamat malam, selamat tidur, dan sampai jumpa lagi. Thank you very much.